There was one phrase running through my mind over and over again during my time with Black Myth Wukong. I'm surprised. I'm surprised at how much fun I'm having. I'm surprised at how invested I am in this world. I'm surprised that this game that looked like yet another graphical tech demo is actually a real game. We've seen so many games that look beautiful on reveal only to turn out as total duds when it comes to the actual game. But Black Myth Wukong delivered. It's no masterpiece, sure, but I was surprised because what actually is in there is far more compelling than it had any right to be. It's not only gorgeous, but also showcases a plethora of very well thought out design decisions, from gameplay mechanics to narrative presentation and everything in between. And also struggles with some disappointing inconsistencies throughout those decisions. So I want to take a deep dive into those moving parts to figure out why and how it all comes together and where it falls apart. Before we start this journey, I want to clarify that I will be discussing gameplay spoilers fully, and I will give another warning later when I delve into the narrative spoilers for those concerned about that aspect. Journey to the West is one of the most famous novels of all time, but even for those familiar with it, Black Myth's rendition of the story is worth experiencing the way they intended first. And also for anyone curious, I played on PC, completed multiple playthroughs on New Game and New Game Plus, 100% cleared the game, and I played on the initial launch version of the game in case any patches change anything. For clarity, I will be referring to the game as Black Myth so as to avoid confusion with the titular character. And with that out of the way, take my hand and join me on this journey to the Black Myth. Black Myth Wukong is not a Souls-like. Or that's what people said before release. It's got some shared mechanics, sure, but the design ethos is fundamentally different. That logic made sense to me, but then I played it and experienced my first moment of surprise in that, no, this game has a lot of Souls-like DNA. So I figure I should address this right off the bat. Just because a game has respawning enemies and a reusable healing system doesn't make it a Souls-like. Hell, the Estus Flask is just a fundamentally good design choice for creating compelling exploration that even more games should probably use. But what does make something a Souls-like? There's lots of differing opinions on the matter and no real consensus. To me, the most important aspect is keeping that Metroidvania DNA that the genre spun off from, with compelling interconnected worlds that can be explored out of order. To others, it's about the feel of the combat, or the complexity or lack thereof in combat and enemies, or God forbid, the difficulty. So is Black Myth a Souls-like? Honestly, I don't care. I care far less about what genre label to slap on the game than I do about the actual mechanics being implemented in the game and the goals of those mechanics. So I'm going to compare each design choice to the relevant points of comparison regardless of whether that's a Souls game or a shooter or anything else. If you think it's a Souls-like or it's not a Souls-like, you can make that call yourself, and I support your choice. To me, all that matters is, does it work for this game and what this game is trying to do? Also, yes, it's a Souls-like. Okay, that's out of the way, now let's talk about those mechanics. The game starts with a classic tutorial where you briefly play as an endgame build in a beautiful and scene-setting arena before stripping the player away of all of that and starting from scratch. Personally, I don't enjoy those types of introductions as I want to explore and discover the mechanics myself instead of seeing them up front. And since I just started the game, I have no idea what I'm doing and just feel overwhelmed by the full kit being introduced immediately. But it functions well as a teaser for players who need to be sold on the game, so that's fine. Even that one line of discussion is probably more harping than it deserves. But it leads me into my first piece of praise, which is that the game paces out its systems and tutorials exceptionally well. After the flashy intro, you start with the pure basics, and the game lets you immediately play. The player is only introduced to the skill tree after clearing the first section, and then spells are introduced during the first mini-boss. Spirits are unlocked after beating a few mini-bosses, and transformations are only unlocked after beating a side boss. And so on across a number of other mechanics across the rest of the game too. They are paced well not just in terms of introduction, but in terms of player time. There's no long, drawn-out tutorials that stop everything to make sure you use it right. The player is given the tool, told how it works, and then sent off to experiment however they want.
It's not hard to learn.
Hand in hand with this is the beautiful manner in which this progression is shown, or more importantly hidden, during the process. The UI evolves over time, showing parts of what's coming, but also hiding key elements until the reveal, thus keeping the player excited and curious about what new mechanics might get introduced. When the player first gets access to spells, they only see the one skill tree, There are locked sections that clearly correspond to other unusable skill buttons, but the way the game expands the UI to fit an entire new skill tree section once the first duplicate spell type is unlocked is brilliant. There was no indication of a second or third skill tree. The tree was even centered so you couldn't guess based on the UI positioning. The spacing shifts to fit 2 and then 3 trees seamlessly. Even at the end of the game, I was still curious that maybe there were even more skills that I missed somewhere behind some secret, and I couldn't just use the lack of obvious UI space as a meta-level way to debunk that excitement.
No one can read what's not written.
That's a lot of thoughtful attention to detail for what many might dismiss as an entirely superfluous consideration. But I noticed it, and even if you didn't consciously notice it, it probably affected your experience without your even realizing it. It's a subtle piece of love and care that goes a long way towards making a compelling experience and keeping the player on their toes. It's one thing to be looking forward to surprises, but it's another thing when you have no idea what new surprises could even be. And I think that's what elevates this game so far beyond a lot of similar games. Because the core gameplay is a bit simple, and if we take a step back, the game is rather generic in its mechanical design choices, looking somewhat like a run-of-the-mill action game. But these little touches can be seen on every element, those special flourishes that make each individual part feel a bit better than what the overall summation of those parts actually is. Because when you zoom in, each design choice in the game feels like it had a special something added to give it flavor. You don't just have Estus, you have a cool suite of customizable Estus options. You don't simply have respawning enemies from shrines, but you can actually access the utilities of the shrines without automatically resetting the whole level. You don't merely have a beautiful title screen, but instead there is a unique title screen for every single area and sub-area in the game that changes based on where you logged out from. Having an eyesore UI element always telling the player where to go sucks, but having a subtle golden trail of particles leading to each shrine when the player is close is elegant and thoughtful. From animation work, to menu and UI design, to gameplay elements, I was constantly surprised by how often I noticed some small touch and thought, wow, that's actually quite clever.
That's good. Very good.
Instead of having early game armor sets that become outdated, the player eventually unlocks armor upgrading, allowing the player to use any armor set and keep the numbers on par for the current content. This means the player is free to find builds and set bonuses that complement their playstyle instead of being forced into trying to do whatever the one current level armor does. Here's a list of all the new features introduced over the course of the game in the order that I encountered them. Due to the non-linearity, you might find some in a slightly different order or miss them entirely, but generally speaking, there's quite a lot and they help keep that constant stream of freshness going. Each time I thought I understood how builds worked, I was surprised with a new little addition. Having played Souls games, I thought I knew how healing charges worked, but Black Myth added creative ways to tweak that. I thought I had my one weapon, but Black Myth surprised me with not only weapon upgrades, but also hidden trees within the upgrades, and also entirely different weapons that bring brand new functionality from the default staff. Though the exact implementation of the secondary moveset is a bit underbaked and feels a little inconsistent based on the way that the rest of the weapons work in the game. Going back to that list though, I want to also highlight how many are implemented creatively such that there is no UI indication at all, not even a locked icon, that hints to the player that there is something new to unlock, only to expand the UI to add on this new functionality. The menu space for spirits doesn't even show up as empty until they're unlocked. Each new transformation adds a new skill and repositions the full page, so I never knew how many there were until the end. And the UI always looks clean and natural every time it's updated. Many games struggle to have usable UIs even without needing to dynamically update them. Black Myth manages to keep a clean and intuitive UI regardless of what pieces the player has or hasn't unlocked.
Then you do indeed have skills.
What this all comes together to create, though, is a really dynamic system of character builds. Because there's so many different levers that can be pulled, there ends up being a surprisingly fun level of creativity to mixing and matching different pieces to experiment with different builds. Rather than having only a select few equipment slots that need to have extremely complicated traits and subtraits in order to create playstyle diversity, Black Myth spreads more easily understood effects across each and every one of the player's gameplay elements, resulting in a much more elegant and cohesive package. Each piece can have a fun and unique special effect that makes it perpetually exciting to find something new and see what it does, and to think about how you could take advantage of that new effect. And there's care to make those effects actually meaningful across the whole game too. For example, there are several early items that give bonuses for standing in water. In a different game, this would be such a unique and niche effect that it's really only good against the 1 or 2 nearby bosses where the player can actually get it to work. But if you're paying attention, there's a whole lot of water surfaces across this game's levels, including a solid chunk of the bosses. It shows the devs paid attention and put care into crafting the game to accommodate even these seemingly niche effects so that they feel viable and powerful no matter where you are in the game. If you're paying attention to the environment, there's probably some way that you can end up using nearby water to accommodate this effect in almost all of the game. And that's true across almost the whole range of effects and builds, though there are still a couple builds that feel much more difficult to piece together, but it's possible that it can come together and I just wasn't able to put the pieces together myself.
Idiot!
Unfortunately, there's also some parts of the progression that don't quite meet the same bar of quality, so let's break down some of that now. First, in the same way that I praised the armor upgrading system for allowing each set to be equally viable at any point in the game, the weapons fall into exactly the trap that the armor fix solves. The weapons are much more sparse than armors and have set damage numbers, so while you might prefer to use the spear with the cool thrust stance moves, it's just plain worse than the new one with higher damage, which makes it feel disappointing to use knowing that you are intentionally gimping yourself, and disappointing for the player to unequip it as now they are being forced to change their build, not to overcome a fun challenge, but just to keep from falling off the progression treadmill. It's fun to change your build when it feels like you're solving a puzzle. It's not fun when it feels like the game is forcing you to just do what it wants. There's also a weird imbalance where some of the weapons have upgrade trees and others have no upgrades at all, or vastly more limited trees. Perhaps they wanted to flesh out each weapon more but ran out of time and so just focused on the main one, or perhaps this was the intended plan, but either way, the inconsistency between some weapons and others makes the whole weapon system feel a bit underdeveloped. If they wanted to keep the strict damage progression, they should probably have taken a lesson out of their own book and made the weapon special effects equipable attachments that can be swapped between a couple core weapons, like they did with the gourd system. Speaking of which, while I cannot understate how clever I found the drinks and soaks systems, letting the player customize what is a fairly standard and well-trod healing system in creative ways that I had never seen before, I must also make the same criticism about the upgrade structure of the gourds and drinks. The vast majority cannot be upgraded at all, leaving the upgrade materials to be completely worthless if you are using anything other than the 2 gourds or drinks that actually have upgrades.
Quite odd, that is.
Now, part of me would understand if only the primary gourd and drink upgraded and that was its gimmick instead of having a unique ability of its own, though I don't quite enjoy that solution either, but having a couple to upgrade just highlights how weird it is that most of the rest can't be upgraded. A couple can be quote-unquote upgraded by finding the upgraded version in the world, which on its own is a fine way to do progression, but combines rather inelegantly with the system of menu-based upgrading from collecting upgrade materials that is also used for the other gourds. Pick one or the other. Both systems can be made well, and it's probably possible that a fusion system could work if designed around it, but this just feels sloppy. The manner in which the drink upgrade materials feel worthless if I'm not using those gourds or soaks also serves to undercut the level design, as what should be a meaningful reward becomes a disappointment, but more on that when I get to the level design.
Let's worry about that later.
First, we need to explore down this side path and take a look at the combat mechanics. Right off the bat, we need to address one thing. As I touched on earlier, some people want to call this a Souls-like, and others want to say it's not a Souls-like and is much closer to a character action game. If this were a character action game, the combat would be comparatively utter dog shit. So for the sake of the game and also accuracy, let's talk about it in the scope of Souls-likes.
Your rudeness is forgiven.
The actual character options for the player are rather limited. You have a single light attack combo, a heavy attack, a dodge, a jump, and some minor tertiary tools like sprinting and spinning. This can be mixed up using the 3 different stances which alter the heavy attack and each provide a different heavy attack combo, and also a few spells that do simple but useful things, but for the most part players will be spamming the same light attack combo for the entire game and weaving in the other tools as necessary. If this sounds like a negative though, then you'd be wrong. But in order to discuss this, we have to accept a basic truth about Souls games that many might find difficult to swallow. As the brilliant Matthew Matosis puts it,
we have to confront a hard truth that few people seem to want to face about the Souls games, including FromSoft themselves, but here it is. The combat is nothing remarkable.
But that doesn't mean it's boring or that it isn't well made. See, that's the core difference between combat in character action games and Souls-style games. Character action games give the player an incredibly complex suite of tools and combos and other elements to work with as they fight what often amounts to an animated punching bag. Souls-style games keep the character themselves with a very few basic but elegant tools and shift all of that complexity onto the enemies. Each enemy has a unique dance that the player needs to figure out how to slot their tools into. I've long suspected that this is why Souls games have become incredibly popular, while Bayonetta and Devil May Cry have never made it out of that cult classic territory. It's far easier for a player to wrap their mind around a few simple tools and solve creative puzzles with those tools than it is for a player to internalize complex control schemes and long confusing multi-button combinations. All of that is to say that the combat in this design space hinges on two aspects: the elegance of the tools provided and the quality of the enemies. So let's look at those tools. First, let's establish the baseline combat experience. The core combat cycle is using the light attack combo to build up to the finisher and eventually building enough focus points to use a heavy attack with extra power. Since the enemies are not simply punching bags standing there and taking it, the player also needs to manage defensive tools to properly avoid being hit too. Black Myth forgoes any type of shield system, leaving the player's defensive options relying exclusively on dodges, sort of. One of the two optional spells for the top slot is a rock shield, which functions as a parry, and one of the stances provides a counterattack type functionality for proper timing. However, a player could reasonably play the full game never engaging with or making use of those tools, so it's not quite fair to judge them as part of the core moveset, but also the character's complexity is not so large that they should be written off entirely either. The game expects that you probably will make use of them, even though you might not. The early core moves that I do expect every player to be getting are the ability to continue the light attack combo after dodging and healing upon using focus points, to the point where I think that these two should probably be part of the baseline moveset and not the skill trees, given how required they feel for the core game experience. Since dodging is the primary defensive mechanism, having it cancel your combo buildup means that it breaks the entire core cycle until that ability is unlocked, and likewise, the ability to heal off of focus point attacks supplements the core risk vs reward structure of an Estus-style healing system by letting the player technically heal infinitely, but only if they play well enough to earn it. It's quite similar to the regenerated healing mechanic from Lies of P, and possibly even a more clever solution, which makes it stand out more that it's not just part of the core mechanics. It is unlockable right away, but it's not really highlighted as something more important than anything else, and at a gameplay level, it very much is more important than almost everything else. Once these tools are in place, the core combat flows quite elegantly as the player tries to build up a combo, weaving dodges in when required, and using both combo finishers and heavy attack finishers to push damage bursts. The pieces flow nicely into each other and are beautifully animated on top of it, and require a fun level of learning how long each section of the light attack string is so as to properly weave in more, or else position to set up the continuation after reacting to the enemy for a bit. I do think the limited pool of defensive options has a more profound effect on dragging down the gameplay, as the game can fall into simply being a dodge simulator, though I think that's true of nearly every Souls-like except perhaps Sekiro or Lies of P, so perhaps that's not quite fair to harp on here. For a studio's first attempt at a designed combat system of this kind, it's a remarkable job. And also the other abilities that I haven't mentioned yet spice this up in interesting ways too, though I'm not sure all are quite so elegant. While I like the spirit system a lot for its customization of passive abilities, the active abilities feel a bit clunkier. It's lovingly ripped right out of Nioh 2 in that you collect singular moves from each enemy to morph into them and activate, and they are kind of fun, but it also feels a bit like a tedious cooldown to keep track of rather than a meaningful or useful tool to mix into the core combat loop. Perhaps there are some with more utility than others, but I think most players will end up forgetting to use them at all in most fights. Rather than repeat myself, I just want to ditto everything I said but for the vessels, both on the passive fronts and on the active fronts. And on a personal level, the 2-button combo input involving clicking in a stick feels extraordinarily clunky.
Vile and evil it is.
Again, taking a page right out of Nioh's living weapon and yokai shift systems, transformations in Black Myth allow for a short gameplay section playing as a different creature with a new health bar. At a combat level, this is valuable primarily as a way to push safe extra damage and to mix up the combat with a simple but different combat structure briefly. Each transformation essentially boils down to building up and then using their big special move, and again functions like a cooldown that needs to be managed. However, in comparison to the spirits and vessels, this has greater implications for combat, and thus feels a bit better. Beyond simply providing entertaining variety, it can also be used as both an offensive and defensive tool. Since the transformations have their own health bar and different movement and dodging mechanics, they can be used to tank or more easily avoid certain difficult sections of a boss's fight. It's still somewhat inelegant, but there's a decent amount of strategic depth in how you use them, and mechanically it fits well enough. Then we have the different spells, which are each locked to a certain slot. One slot is dedicated to making clones, ignoring the New Game Plus only spell that shares its slot. One slot can be filled with either a stealth dash move or the previously mentioned rock parry, and the primary slot can use Immobilize, Ring of Fire, and Spellbinder. Making clones is fun and can be seriously abused in New Game Plus, but is generally unremarkable as a piece of the moveset. It's a higher value big move that makes the combat into a bit more of a mess and less of a technical rhythmic dance, as the enemy AI doesn't seem fully designed around handling more than one target, but it's still fairly powerful and visually fun even if not tactically fun. What I really want to talk about, however, is the amount in which these spells can enhance the core package. The Rock Shield is rather simple. Time it right to parry a powerful move, and get a free opportunity to attack. It's an elegant extra defensive tool that feels excellent to pull off, and feels like it should even possibly have been a core part of the base kit.
I would be dead if it weren't for you.
And also is a really unique idea that no game has ever done before. In contrast, the Cloud Dash spell that can replace this one is much less elegant. That's not to say it's not useful, it's quite strong in its own way and a great way to get a really big hit in, but it feels more like a sticker slapped onto the core kit than a crucial piece of the kit. And as such, I think it can lead to combat feeling vastly less interesting due to the lack of the rock parry. This is probably exacerbated by the fact that the dodge button is the only real defensive tool in the game, so adding in the parry expands the freedom of options massively by comparison. Technically, the invisibility of the Cloud Dash could be counted as a defensive tool, but the cooldown is massively longer and the upgrades focus around keeping the player in stealth and enhancing the next sneak attack afterwards, whereas the upgrades to Rock Solid focus on reducing the cooldown and letting the player activate it more on demand. In my own usage, enemies would often still just target me during invisibility regardless, but that's more of a technical issue than a design one. One could also use the invisibility period to freely heal and use consumables, but that's a rather niche use case, and with 2 or 3 exceptions, every boss provides ample space and time to heal up when you need it anyway. The final set of spells, though, is by far the most interesting to analyze. Let's start with Ring of Fire, which, despite my best efforts, it was very difficult for me to find a valid use case for. At its best, it lets me get extra healing in, but often it was at the cost of taking extra hits to stay in the circle, making the process feel net neutral. Additionally, the design ethos behind making the player try to stand in one small area in a game about dynamic positioning feels somewhat antagonistic to what makes the core combat feel good in the first place.
It hurts no foe but binds yourself.
But more than anything, the biggest factor behind the ring feeling weak is that it's competing with the 2 most powerful spells in the game. One for great reasons, and one for more dubious reasons. Let's unpack that. Immobilize is the first spell given by the game, and I would say the primary iconic spell of the game. I would wager with great confidence that it is almost every player's most used spell during the game, and that's for good reason. It's a brilliantly designed spell that, much like the rock parry, fits into the core moveset perfectly. The spell can be used to lock an enemy in place for the player to wail on them and get free hits in. Usually this will result in a stagger and another free set of attacks after breaking the stasis. It's an excellent and more importantly immensely satisfying offensive tool. But more than that, it also serves a dual purpose that isn't quite immediately clear as well.
Trust me, there's more to it.
See, freezing the enemy can be used defensively in a number of ways too, whether that's to buy time to heal or apply buffs, much like the Cloud spell, but also by interrupting a powerful move from a boss, or by stopping an attack that you don't quite have the knowledge or positioning to avoid properly. It's a dynamic and versatile skill in very elegant ways. I was able to use it to effectively counter the hard part of a boss's kit in many scenarios, and thus it became a vital part of the calculus of any given boss fight. I need to make sure to time my uses right to keep it ready for a lethal mistake, but also, if I can squeeze it in properly, I can get a massive burst of free damage in at the risk of not having it ready when I'm in danger. This dual purpose between offensive and defensive creates an inherently compelling risk versus reward structure for the player to be managing during the entire fight. It adds a great layer of complexity for skilled players to make use of, but also gives newer players a safe, easy-to-use tool for them to learn and experiment with. And it's also just damn satisfying to use. But beyond that, there's also upgrades that allow it to be used without interrupting the light attack combo string, making it feel even more seamless in the player's kit, to the point where I once again wonder if it shouldn't have just been a default upgrade to the core kit instead of an optional choice.
Those knuckleheads.
Playing the game without Immobilize feels somewhat like playing God of War without the throwable axe, or playing Mario Kart without drifting, or playing Deus Ex without using vents, or playing Batman Arkham Asylum without using vents, or playing Among Us without using vents. Why do so many games use vents?
Snake!
Anyway, the point is, for each of those games you could do it that way, but the game clearly is designed around you using that mechanic. And to not use what feels like such an integral piece of the core combat loop feels bad. So you can understand why I'm about to say that by contrast, Spellbinder is an example of a very poorly made tool. It asks the player to give up on all of the interesting options that spice up the combat for the sake of a straightforward damage increase. While some of the spells may feel like simple cooldowns to use the moment they are ready, as opposed to those that feel like core parts of the kit, it all combines to make the total package a more varied and interesting one. Managing the cooldown of the Vessel and the Spirit move and the transformation while weaving light attack combo strings together and avoiding enemy moves while waiting for or even trying to create opportunities to use spells, all while also building and managing focus points, is an interesting combat flow, especially with all the variance between all the different Spirit moves and transformations that can be equipped. The player is actively calculating when best to use all of these tools, and that makes the otherwise fairly straightforward combat much more interesting. When you strip all of that away and reduce combat to mashing light attack until a heavy attack is ready, and timing dodges as necessary, the combat loop becomes drastically less engaging. Now, don't get me wrong, the damage increase from Spellbinder is powerful, but that's actually more evidence that the spell is a detriment to the game rather than a boon. It makes the game easier at the cost of the fun of the combat.
Just for the sake of winning. How absurd and pathetic.
And it doesn't just make the game easier, it makes the game incredibly easy. The damage boost can be astoundingly large, so powerful that I spent a large chunk of my first playthrough using it and ended up beating almost every boss except these few on my first attempt. And I'm not saying that to brag or to decry the game's difficulty or lack thereof. I'm saying it to express my disappointment at not being able to have the fun loop of studying, learning, and overcoming so many of the bosses in the game simply because one tool was so powerful and I didn't realize it until it was too late. And this is even more true because of how fun and diverse all of the different boss fights actually are.
You have grown in strength, but not in wisdom.
But let me be clear. The fact that it is overtuned is simply a number issue that can, and hopefully will, be tweaked and fixed. The primary aspect of the design issue of this spell stems from it being one that removes the fun and complexity from a combat system that is already on the simpler side. And unless it's being used as some type of challenge run, it's almost always the case that encouraging players to use fewer of the game's systems and interact with the game's mechanics less is simply not good game design, though there certainly can be good exceptions. As a game design sidebar, I'm also of the opinion that having there be ways to do things that feel overpowered can work and even be great, but it needs to manifest as the result of a creative strategy from the player. Finding a synergy between a few skills and weapons means that the player has, in a sense, earned that powerful result. Whereas using a single button press to permanently turn off everything and become overpowered doesn't feel like an earned reward from anything that the player did. One could argue that since it's a missable spell, the act of finding it in the first place is the earned part here, but I think a God mode type tool should probably have much more to the process of earning it, and the quest here is a pretty hard one to miss and not a very difficult one to complete either. In my opinion, this kind of become strong but make gameplay simple type effect should be limited to something like a short duration consumable, which actually is exactly how the transformations function. The player becomes a stronger, more cinematic character for a bit with a drastically simplified combat structure. This works because the gameplay then becomes about making the most use of it while it lasts, which is a compelling sub-goal instead of reducing the entire game to play like that. So yeah, I don't even need to suggest a fix because the game already contains a well-balanced, proper implementation of the same idea. And one that also feels cooler because of the novelty of becoming this bigger, more badass character. All of the transformations keep the same general combat flow too, of building up to one big move by spamming small moves or getting hit. It's possible that Spellbinder was included as an opt-in easy mode tool for players that need a hand, much like the way that summons exist in Dark Souls, but given that it's introduced halfway through the game and missable, it doesn't quite work well if that was the purpose either, as that's not exactly how or where that type of player would need the assistance.
Come on, cut the weeps and whines, will you? You're too old for those!
The final piece of the combat flow is stances. However, I'm not actually sure how much they really add here. It's not clear if the intent was to have the player swap between the stances on the fly, or commit to one stance and master it, and that's both because the skill point investment required is significant to fully unlock a stance, and the actual gameplay difference between the stances is actually quite small. The only thing a stance changes is the heavy attack. The light attack combo that most of the game will be spent using is identical across all 3 stances, so the tangible effect of using a different stance is which finisher move you want to use. Big slam, big poke, or a different big slam. Even within that, the differences are minor. The use case for all of them is still stand close to the enemy and press triangle.
Some cheap tricks!
There's some extra nuance to that, like thrust stance giving a dash back move which feels at best equal to a dodge, but realistically worse because it doesn't proc all of the slowdown, focus generation, and damage boosts that a perfect dodge would. And also a few unique but clunky move combos from the heavy attack. I personally struggled to find a reliable way to integrate them into the combat loop. The heavy attack in general feels weirdly clunky and delayed, so I found it was best to just always save it for a single press on a still enemy rather than trying to use the niche stance effects. It's possible other players may find a good use for them, but in all my attempts, it always felt like the more optimal and consistent approach was using light attacks to build focus and only using the heavy attack or combos as finishers or for healing. Standing still to stab repeatedly, spin in a circle, or charge focus points was always too slow and stationary for a game that wants you to be constantly moving.
Seemed like certain death.
The one generally useful tool is Pillar Stance, which makes charging the stance to a ground avoidance tool. This is helpful for a multitude of attacks and effects across the game, which also makes it feel weird to be attached to a stance since it's a general use all-purpose skill. If the design intent was to have players commit to a stance, then they would lose out on what feels like a very important tool when using the other stances, and the other stances don't offer anything equivalent in the space of general utility. It feels like a fundamental mobility tool, but is weirdly placed in the skill tree for weapons. It would be like if Breath of the Wild said you could only use the glider when you have a spear equipped. It just feels out of place. And if the intent were to have players swap between stances frequently, then the implementation of the very disparate stance trees makes that feel suboptimal, as you'd have to forgo a lot of the points in spells and stats to make use of all of the stances and their combos, and actually access their unique parts. In general, it feels like the best thing to do is to keep one point in Pillar to be able to get off the ground when needed, and otherwise just avoid the stance skills entirely in order to buff up the other parts of the core combat package. But again, that could be me undervaluing the usefulness of stances. It's just that, across my playthroughs and all my experimentation, I couldn't really find anything that felt better or even comparable to just having strong spells. And in looking online, I couldn't really find anyone else describing a super useful way to make use of stances either.
And I'm always toiling away for nothing.
It's a bit disappointing, because conceptually, I think it's a cool way to vary up the combat, but the final implementation we got just doesn't quite work, and so combat feels largely identical regardless of stance choice. This is the kind of thing I would normally suggest deserves extra examination in order to reinvent the system in a more beneficial way for a sequel, rather than scrapping the system, but it seems to me that Black Myth will be more of an anthology-type experience, exploring a different character in the next game, so perhaps all that can be done here is lament the way that stances appear as though they should be the primary way the game creates meaningful differences in combat, given how much focus is placed on them, and how they take up an entire section of the skill tree but end up feeling like an afterthought. When combining this with the new set of moves that the spear weapons give the player, it feels weird and inconsistent that one random and not even very powerful weapon totally reinvents the core combat, whereas the 3 core stances barely change it at all. In the same way that many spells feel like an elegant extension of combat mechanics, stances feel inelegantly tacked on.
You should do better than that.
Even with many of these pieces feeling inelegant and dragging the combat flow to a more simple one, the game manages to alleviate that by having the other half of the equation be more well balanced. Because, while you can reduce the defensive half of combat to press dodge when required, the implementation of those requirements makes a big difference. And to discuss that, we need to move away from the player's moveset and over to that of the bosses and enemies. That's right, just like a game with boring enemies requires the player toolset to do a lot of heavy lifting, a game with a simple player toolset requires the challenges to do the heavy lifting. And Black Myth's enemies can lift a lot. First, I have to commend the sheer quantity of bosses. There's around 90 or so bosses in the game depending on how you want to count reskinned fights, and while not everyone is a mechanical masterpiece, they still essentially all function and animate uniquely. I'd say maybe a third are more basic mini-bosses, but they still each have unique movesets and mechanics. There's no boss that makes me go, it's just like that other boss but with a different visual. That's incredibly impressive, especially with how well made all of their different designs and animations are. If I've done my math right, there are more unique bosses in this single game than the entire Dark Souls trilogy combined and all of their DLCs. And again, not everyone is a fully fleshed out full-on boss, but everyone brings something unique, and more than anything, the diversity kept the feeling of freshness going. I was continually surprised as I kept seeing more and more, thinking they've got to be almost out by now, or at least they've got to start reskinning them, right? Only to be proven wrong as I found another massive set of new and fresh bosses.
It's grander in scope.
I think unfortunately, as a result of Black Myth's focus on excitement over difficulty, many players will end up not seeing what a lot of the bosses have to offer. I expect every player to cruise through a solid chunk of the bosses, though not necessarily the same ones, and I think that's both a blessing and a curse. Not every boss will be fully appreciated for the time and effort that went into designing the fight, but also due to the sheer quantity, players can miss a bunch and still have a plethora of other bosses that they were able to fully engage with. And of course, the main bosses go a really long way to bring the shine here. Both the final chapter bosses and the secret area bosses, and even many of the more developed bosses from the in-between, all have the level of spectacle and complexity that makes them legitimately fun fights. They are mechanically interesting with different combat styles and surprisingly engaging personalities, which is not something one usually expects in a Souls-type game, but was certainly appreciated.
I am entertained.
I don't want to bog down the video by going one by one through each boss, so I will simply highlight a few to make specific points. The manner in which many of the bosses like the Demon Boy or the Tiger Vanguard are characters which are woven into the game's narrative and lore was surprisingly fun. I'll touch on this more when I get to the narrative section, but suffice to say that it was fun to somewhat understand bosses when fighting them, versus other games where the player would have to piece together a lot of the information to figure out who the boss was or why they were important long after fighting them. I also love when games have optional sub-objectives that unlock something that makes my experience feel more unique, and that can be seen from the father and son fight, which surprised me by ending instantly once I had killed the son despite not touching the father's health bar at all. This resulted in the father fleeing and providing a bit more exposition, but can also be accomplished by defeating the father first, which will result in an extra spirit, along with a slightly changed way to encounter the next son, and an entirely different song from our minstrel friend. This can also be seen to a lesser degree from the Venom Taoist, who can have his arms removed from hitting them specifically, and will reward a special armor if all bonus arms are removed. I wouldn't say the implementation of these is perfect, however, as it's a bit frustrating to tie items to an optional sub-objective in a fight. If this were an RPG, then I'd be all for it, as decisions and consequences are the most important part of an RPG. But in a more action-style game, missing items because you didn't succeed on a sub-objective that you might not have even been aware of, and also being told that you can't try again is a bit disappointing.
Well, I hardly think that's fair.
I'd much rather see the mechanics be used in more interesting ways, such as being limited to the scope of the boss's move pool, or by changing something meaningful about a different fight. Maybe based on how many arms you removed, the Taoist refight will have more or fewer arms available based on the arms he survived with. Or maybe the other son gets some kind of special power by having just consumed his pa. These kinds of unique changes are cool and fun to discover and interact with, without leaving the player feeling like they are limited from accessing the build path they wanted to try out, but they needed that item for. The game only has a select few examples of these types of dynamic objectives, and this is a very ripe area for future games to explore, so I hope they do. There are naturally also some bosses that are not so great. Two specifically stand out as particularly bad for different reasons, though I'm sure that there are some other not so great ones that I just didn't inspect enough to really draw out their flaws. Trust me, these two will be more than enough to discuss. First, I'd like to highlight the giant Shigandang. It's that weird gimmick-type boss that always ends up being divisive and controversial, but I'm gonna have to stick to my guns here and say that this one in particular is really bad.
You nasty slanderer!
Hey, me from the future here. I originally wrote up a massive section detailing this, but it felt too whiny and was way too much time on a single bad boss, so instead I rewrote this section to just give a couple quick notes without all of the nuance. I apologize, but also I just saved you 30 minutes, so you're welcome. The boss is extremely unclear as to what to actually hit. The AI reset constantly, especially upon getting too close, leading to more confusion as I thought that I had to get close to hit something or to figure out what to hit. The stomp always one-shots and has no feedback for dodging, which is weirdly inconsistent as it's the only move in the game that feels intentionally undodgeable. It feels more like a punishment for not interacting with the gimmick of the boss properly, but also, in order to figure out what the gimmick was, I had to die to the stomp several times. The fight itself, once you realize you need to not get too close, is also just boring. Dodge a handful of super basic platforming attacks and then wail away on an unresponsive pile of rocks. It's especially disappointing as the culmination fight of a massive all-game-long secret questline.
All thanks to this dumb thing.
I think I was probably just unlucky to have it interact so clearly brokenly with me so many times before it becoming clear what the actual fight was, but I'm also not totally sure, and for that reason I have to criticize it, as it's not clear what the proper way to figure out how to fight this actually is.
We've got to tough it out.
The other and actual worst fight in the game is Kang Jin Long. It encapsulates all of the very worst elements of boss fights in this game, and also the worst elements of dragon fights from other games like wonky hitboxes and spending half or more of the fight chasing after it once it flies away, only for it to fly away again as soon as you reach it. But it also adds on top massive camera problems, which is at the game's worst here, and also targeting issues. Again, a problem somewhat extant across the entire game, but very obviously noticeable here, as the game tries to lock the player onto a couple very specific points, so often attacks would end up missing due to trying to send the character past the easily hittable section in front of me to chase after a much more elusive and harder to hit farther away point. Again, this is not the only boss with these types of problems, but it's the one that encapsulates all of them and displays most of them at their worst, so I'm using it to demonstrate the problems.
Your grim fate alone speaks for that old Long's bullying.
On a larger scale, the game's camera works well maybe 90% of the time, but a disappointingly large number of mostly bosses end up moving in ways that can make the camera a massive hassle, often from obscuring certain parts of the boss, which is important when the combat is primarily based around reacting to the enemies, rather than proactively performing combos as discussed earlier. If most of the combat's depth comes from the enemies being the complex part, then any combat where the enemy is not clearly portrayed is a problem. To be clear, you can design mechanics around obfuscating clarity, provided that it's intentional and designed as a sort of mechanical puzzle that's integrated into the fight dynamics. For example, this area where there are tons of enemies that can harass the player from off-camera. The trap of the area is not noticing them and aggroing too many at once. But this isn't bad because it's on the player for not engaging intelligently. Instead of rushing down the ambush path, consider examining the environment, find the high ground, take out the ambushers in smaller manageable groups instead.
You don't think you can just parade in, do you?
This is actually good game design, as it makes use of the mechanic to provide an interesting and diverse challenge that asks the player to think somewhat differently about combat. During combat, positioning is important, and management of enemies is also important. Allowing an enemy to flank you is a failure on your part to properly manage the encounter designed for you. That said, the camera not providing enough clarity to show what the boss is actually doing is the opposite of good game design. Unless it's a fight specifically and intentionally designed around engaging with only partial information, of which none of the bosses in this game are, then this lacks clarity and is a major problem. Sometimes this occurs from animations being muddled or unclear, but Black Myth actually does a wonderful job of making clear, readable animations in almost every instance. Sometimes this issue occurs from the camera not properly handling the scope of the fight. Usually this means the camera simply needs to be pulled back to show more of the fight, though there are certainly other game design solutions as well, and I think in many cases it is simply this combination of certain larger enemies just being too big for the camera, or perhaps animating too wildly to stay on camera cleanly, and the camera's lock-on points not aligning well with watching the boss. Some bosses have lock-on points designed around the easiest point for the player to strike the enemy, which is good in that respect, but then those points are not well designed for actually watching the boss. In order to target the proper spot, I have to cut off half of my vision of the boss, meaning I can't properly fight it.
I feel blind. Blind!
So, in reality, the issue is not quite the camera, but the lack of proper camera lock-on points. When fighting larger enemies, other games often make use of having a lock-on point for attacking, and another one or two for being able to watch the target. I don't think this is the best solution compared to simply expanding the camera out, but it's just one example of a partial solution from other similar games. I want to make one additional point on the camera, as I think this is underappreciated by any analysis that I've seen on the game too. Due to Black Myth opting for a combat structure very highly inspired by Souls-likes, but also injecting light character action elements in, a sort of new problem arises with the camera system as well. In Dark Souls, swinging a weapon does not move the player forward, except minorly if the swing pattern has a step. In more rapid action-style games, there's often a strong magnet effect to pull the player to enemies when swinging. In this manner, Dark Souls asks the player to pay attention to positioning both of the enemy and of the player, making this another integral part of the combat, versus the magnet effect making positioning not so important in comparison to timing, combo management, or other factors. This difference typically works for each style of game, as the combat in those games is designed around that specific style. Black Myth uses a combat base much closer to Souls, but still implements the magneting effect, and even includes it in the skill trees, making positioning somewhat matter, but not fully. For this game, it mostly functions as a crutch for the basic swing patterns all being a bit unwieldy and hard to aim, and thus allowing the player some wiggle room to not have to position perfectly. I think they find a great balance for the game generally, and especially on managing and limiting the magnet effect of enemies, but the issue created by this is that if the player is not locked onto an enemy, it suddenly becomes very difficult. The game cannot quite pull the player to the correct position, as it doesn't know quite what the target is, and makes the generally more technical combat design into something much less precise.
Who cares anyway?
Now, why am I explaining all of this? Well, because it means that the game effectively can't be played properly without locking on. Other Souls-style games find a partial solution to camera clarity by allowing the player to stop locking on in order to take in the full scope of combat, and this works because those games are fully playable without lock-on, to the point where sometimes making use of not locking on is a smart tactical advantage to be used in different scenarios and to accomplish maneuvers not as easily doable while locked on. Because Black Myth cannot accommodate a non-locked on combat nearly as well, it means that the solution of not locking on doesn't solve the clarity issue and thus exacerbates the camera issues here as opposed to those other games. That was a more technical dive into one single issue, but I think it's important to fully explain due to the oversized negative impact that the camera issues can have in the rare times when they do manifest. And also, as with all my videos, I want to do more than simply state, oh, the camera sucks. I'm striving to figure out exactly why the camera is a problem so that we can all be a little more knowledgeable for having spent the time on it. But also I want to hear your feedback. Do you enjoy it when I dedicate extended periods of the video to doing more specific analysis on individual aspects, or is that too in the weeds?
What do you think of my work?
Anyway, survey over, back to the game at hand. I generally don't think discussions on difficulty are productive, but to anyone who has played a Souls-like, this game is markedly easier than any of those, and I think that's good. The game still finds a balance of bringing fun challenge, and because the game slants to the more forgiving side, it ends up alleviating a lot of the inconsistent issues I've been mentioning. It means that any one hiccup isn't likely to be the difference between success and failure. It's still frustrating when something doesn't work right, but since the margins of victory aren't quite as razor thin, there's plenty of space for things to go wrong and the player can still recover, which makes the negative impact much less painful. Lastly, I have to credit Game Science for being willing to put so many of these cool boss encounters behind secret areas or objectives. I suspect the design intent was for most players to clear the secret areas too, but it makes it feel all the more satisfying when the reward for exploring a cool side zone is also a unique and fun boss fight, rather than a reskinned enemy you fought a dozen times, or just a generally less developed enemy because they don't expect as many players to see it and thus don't put as much time into it.
Wasn't it fun?
The basic enemies are not quite so exciting, which I suppose is natural being that they are the basic enemies, but also just due to their variety. A lot of areas will have the same couple of enemies over and over again, and while enemy diversity across the whole game is impressive, the diversity within smaller sections is hit or miss. Most areas keep the variety coming, but there's a few sections that seem remarkably lacking. It's also worth noting that, especially with the combat designed around enemy complexity, the encounter design can do a lot of the heavy lifting to keep the variety interesting even with the same enemies. But this all depends on the terrain and how the enemies are placed into those levels, so let's move into the level design section in order to properly analyze that.
I've been waiting for your arrival.
To my mind, the level design can be split into two aspects, one of which is surprisingly impressive, and one of which is surprisingly atrocious. It's hard to discuss either without mentioning the other, so I apologize if this section feels a bit crisscrossy. I refuse to apologize for that joke, though. Obviously, as anyone who has played the game knows, the game is littered with invisible walls. Invisible walls plague many games, but also are a necessary evil to keep the game from falling apart and the player from simply walking right out of the game. But these invisible walls are bad. Really bad. It's been so long since I encountered a game with such blatant invisible walls that I was again surprised and shocked because I had almost forgotten that this used to be a massive issue for older games. But okay, it's bad, but why is it bad? Well, because the player doesn't know where to explore and what's off limits. It's always disappointing to be moving somewhere cool only to find that not only can you not go there, but also the reason is that the game is simply saying, nah, we won't let you.
I simply can't.
It's an immersive disconnect. It's one that has an outsized negative mental effect on the player, and it's one that generally has been solved in game design by now. Modern games usually do a good job of placing objects or walls or just some kind of visible obstacle that prevents the player from going to the wrong place. And while it's functionally no different than an invisible wall, it goes a long way to improving the player's experience. But it has an even bigger problematic effect here, and to discuss that we need to talk about what the game does really well, which is level design. See, the game has a lot of really well-crafted and intricate areas that can interweave with each other, leading to shortcuts and secrets and alternate paths galore. It's honestly impressive how much cool, off-the-beaten-path content there is to discover, and how cleverly it is meshed into the level design.
It's better than you think.
In comparison to something like God of War Ragnarok, which functions like linear hallways connecting standalone rooms with either combat or a puzzle before leading to another linear hallway, Black Myth fully embraces the creative level design of the best Souls games with multiple routes to explore, tons of different ways to reach the same place, and genuinely does a great job of it. If you simply look at the playable level architecture, there are many such examples of excellent level design, like the Spider Hollow having several paths leading to multiple possible entrances to the boss room at the bottom. And those paths all interconnect in interesting ways too. This allows the player to always be making progress forward, even if they don't quite fully understand where they are going, because every path will get the player to somewhere interesting, whether that's a side area or one of the many routes to progress the main path. These non-linear levels strike an incredible balance between the super complicated maps of a Metroidvania and the unobtrusive maps of an open-world game. And I was pleasantly surprised by how often I could see an area in the distance and realize that was the area I had just explored, or vice versa, realizing that was an area I am working towards reaching.
I can see the king from here.
That kind of cohesive world design is both impressive and underappreciated, I feel. Black Myth doesn't have any puzzles in its level, at least in the conventional sense of a puzzle, but instead the level design itself is the puzzle. Exploring each area and planning out how to approach the next area, or how to reach a certain area, is the puzzle. Seeing an area behind some walls and thinking, how can I get over there? Or seeing an item or a chest or an enemy in a position that lets me know, okay, I can get that reward over there if only I could figure out how to reach it. These are the types of subtle puzzles that are created by really excellent level design, and Black Myth achieves this quite often through its intelligent complexity. This is also the kind of fun design that a map would often just fully spoil the discovery of, so I'm also thankful to the game for not just including a map and instead relying on and allowing the player to figure out their own way through the world. I usually have a very good sense of direction and terrain in games, so I tend to value more intricate level maps in general, and suffice to say, Black Myth struck the perfect sweet spot for me, where it was just enough that I had to think about where I have and haven't been, but never actually got lost except for one time, due to the well-crafted level design. But I also appreciate that some players might find it too intricate and would have liked an in-game map to help them keep clarity.
It requires no effort to trick you.
While I can appreciate that, there's no shortage of games with simple levels and maps that do all of the thinking for you, so I appreciate a game that is willing to provide a different experience, especially as it's one that, to me, enhances the experience of discovery greatly. For comparison, oftentimes discovery in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, which I love by the way, is undercut by the map clearly showing the path to get to the objective and ruining the experience of discovering it myself. It's refreshing when a game trusts the player to figure things out on their own instead of forcefully holding their hand through all of it.
Oh, this is better.
It's also worth giving credit to the game's UI that it clearly marks interactable items and points from a reasonable distance away, so the player doesn't have to ram their nose into every corner in case they miss something visually small or unclear if they can actually interact with it. Though, as is tradition for this game, there's also one really inconsistent point where for some reason there's just no indication that a secret is hiding behind this wall, and it's quite an important one, blocking away multiple bosses and my favorite weapon in the game. I honestly don't know how a player is expected to find this, as during multiple fights with the sun, I never managed to actually get him to hit and open the crack, and only found it because of guides telling me where to go.
Could never have known that.
Circling back, however, as we can now appreciate the creativity that went into crafting all of these hidden secrets to discover in the world, we can now also understand why the reckless invisible walls create a bigger problem. In a fully linear game with little or no secrets to discover, invisible walls serve to keep the player in the path and not waste their time going anywhere else. That kind of game can have more egregious invisible walls, and it's not as detrimental to the gameplay experience. In a game such as Black Myth, which asks the player to search every corner and find rewards in these little nooks and crannies, having so many invisible walls in what looks like fully traversable terrain creates a massive, and I cannot understate this, massive clarity issue. When the player doesn't know what is traversable or not, it means that they need to ram their face into everything in order to confirm that it is just a wall or not. And this is especially bad as so many secrets are found by just jumping or running through areas indistinguishable from a previous invisible wall. Why can a player not pass this, but there's a very useful secret from going past this? It creates a frustrating gameplay loop whereby the player either has to check every single thing that looks traversable or even doesn't quite look traversable, only to be treated with an invisible wall most of the time,
There's nothing but a rock here.
or else the player chooses to not check at all, missing tons of secrets, cool items, and even narrative beats. There is no reasonable way for a player to be expected to know the difference between a secret and an invisible wall without a relentless amount of tedious trial and error, and that's not a fun gameplay loop to encourage the player to engage in. Additionally, the invisible walls can lead to mental map problems as well, as in, the player walks into an intersection and sees 3 or 4 paths to explore. They traverse one, keeping in mind that mental reminder of a few other paths to go back to and explore. In reality, those other paths only looked like playable paths, but were all blocked off by invisible walls. Now the player is baking confusion into their memory. They remembered seeing some other paths, but when they went back they couldn't find anything. Did they miss it? No, it's just their visual memory of the area doesn't match up with the actual playable representation of that area. There's a mismatch between what they saw and what actually exists, causing them to remember it as an intersection when really there weren't any paths at all, and they had been using brainpower to keep track of a lot of those map landmarks that aren't actually intended.
Found their minds lost and their faith stained.
This complicates traversal. Players are trying to remember 10 paths when actually there's only 2. The signposting and level design of where you can go is actually quite good, but due to the inconsistent terrain, players end up trying to remember a lot of false information too. The true map layout is clear, but the way invisible walls cause people to perceive that layout is far, far more confusing.
The eyes are lured by sight, yet the mind, based on the perception of all, differs.
And I'm willing to bet that that's the reason for a lot of people's confusion during exploration. At a design level, it's an incredibly counterintuitive system that I think they can easily shore up in a sequel, as I suspect they simply glossed over this aspect of game design, which is understandable given that this is the studio's first foray into a big budget game of this size. But it's glaringly obvious and needs to be pointed out, because it could potentially ruin for many players what is an otherwise really well-designed level structure. Most of the time. The invisible walls also have another more mechanical issue, whereby the game uses invisible walls to stop the player from ever falling off of ledges. If the player can fall off a ledge, it's because they can go to the area down there. That's what the game teaches the player. Only for a couple random areas to suddenly not have the guardrails and allow the player to fall to their death in an instant death kill box.
If you seek your own end, I shall not stop you.
There's a creative way to make that be a clever subversion of mechanics, but that's not what's going on here. Since the guardrails are simply from invisible walls, the player has no reason to think that they just simply won't be there, as there's no visual or gameplay indication of any kind when they are or aren't there in the first place. It comes across as the game breaking its own rules simply to play an unfair trick. It doesn't feel fun or clever, it feels broken. And it's solely because of the inconsistent and unclear implementation of invisible walls. The rules are inconsistent, and the game doesn't provide any justification as for why.
It is never a fair game.
Sometimes the game will even put invisible walls to stop you from falling off of a ledge where you can reach the bottom and you would survive the fall, seemingly just to stop the player from getting to that location in a way that they didn't want them to. The one positive, and I suspect the reason why there are so many invisible walls, is that it allows for the environmental design to go crazy. And it does look gorgeous. Many of these vistas are jaw-dropping.
Look at this place!
It's no excuse for the aforementioned gameplay problems, but it would be dishonest to not also point out how beautiful the environments in this game are, and how much worse they would probably look if there were piles of crates or rocks or other obstacles scattered around where the invisible walls are. Again, this is the reason why invisible walls are often very common in more linear, visually cinematic games, but are very rare in games where you're supposed to explore and interact with the world. There are still some other less than ideal elements on the level design beyond the invisible walls too, and also some more praiseworthy elements, so let's address those now. The game uses the gourd system, which inherently creates a fun risk versus reward system to exploration. Does the player heal now, or wait to make a more efficient use of healing and be able to explore more later? And Game Science found an interesting way to have exploration rewards tie into that too. All around the world are groups of 1, 2, or 3 refills to the gourd, which can allow the player to continue exploring further. It's a neat way to give the player a little extension of their trip, and also can feel very satisfying to discover when deep in uncharted territory and running low on health. On the flip side, it can often feel underwhelming when a cool side path ends with only a health refresh. Oftentimes, the player has no need of it, and sometimes it simply replaces the health lost exploring down this path in the first place. They also come with a little currency, but the game gives out so much currency that I was able to buy everything I wanted the moment I wanted to, and never came close to running out. I wonder if there is a better balance to be struck by the gourd refreshes, or if perhaps they should simply be placed in more minor secret alcoves, and not the terminus of a more lengthy side path. The same can be said about the upgrade materials as we mentioned earlier. If you aren't using the only 2 gourds or drinks that need the materials, then a whole side section leading to just that is essentially without reward, leaving the player to feel slapped in the face instead.
What a farce!
Hand in hand with that is the much more satisfying minor reward to find on a side path, which is the spirit enemies. These are cool not only because it's a souped up, more interesting fight with an otherwise familiar enemy, but also because they reward spirits which the player is probably always excited to find, even if just to find out what the new one's effect will be. They cleverly also act as a full gourd refresh, which again leans into allowing the player to expand their exploration trip longer, and also allows the player to fully treat the spirit fight like the mini-boss encounter that it is, and not have to hold back in hopes of not burning too much healing, or even less fun having to run back home and start over again because you used up all your healing on an optional side objective. One could argue that this simplifies the fun of managing exploration a bit too much, and I'm inclined to softly agree, but I think it fits this specific game well, and just generally surprised me as a clever use of mechanics that I hadn't thought of or seen before. Other games have had healing return as a low percentage random drop, but this feels much more intentional and thus elegant in design, as it naturally leads the player to want to explore more and then fight more. Speaking of getting the player to want to fight more, another neat design choice was to have mind cores, which can be used to increase the player's base stats dropped from enemies in the wild. This subtly encourages and rewards players who will actually fight and clear the levels, as the devs intended, instead of sprinting past everything, which has always felt to me like a subversion of the way the game wants the player to interact with it.
Why bother fighting?
In this way, players want to try and kill everything, as there are good, actually meaningful rewards to be found from not just exploration, but also fighting. I initially thought that these were single-time drops from set important enemies, and later realized it's actually a random drop system which fills in that function less well, as instead a player could grind a small area of the same enemies over and over to collect the mind cores. A system that rewarded clearing everything at least once, as I initially thought it functioned, would do much better for convincing players to fully engage with the world, as they wouldn't want to miss anything, and also would allow for fun placement of the enemies with mind cores as a side route reward that feels consistently exciting to earn. But even in their current implementation, it still does a good job of pushing the player in the fun direction. And on the topic of enemy placements, Black Myth also does a good but not great job of using the enemies in the game to complement the level structure and create lots of fun directions for the player to go. Fighting a basic enemy in an open room is a very different experience from fighting the enemy with lava or other environmental hazards around, or with another enemy firing projectiles at the player, or in a cramped stairwell. And Black Myth sets up a lot of engaging encounters to maximize the value of each enemy. It's not perfect across the board, but there's a lot of excellent usage of the terrain to create dynamic new combat puzzles for the player to solve. There's also several areas where the enemies don't feel well placed, and despite the overall solid job, these stand out more as some are very egregious. Most notably certain larger areas where the enemies feel less like puzzle encounters to solve and more like randomly scattered trash to mop up. And to top it off, these are often not evenly divided throughout the game, but rather all clumped together. Then that becomes a pacing issue, which means we need to look at the pacing as a whole, so let's quickly run through the chapters. The first chapter is a good introduction, though somewhat on the linear side. The second chapter switches into a non-linear, very interconnected structure. The third chapter has a few very linear segments tying together a few almost open-world zones, and also is notably longer and slower than any other chapter. The fourth chapter returns to a non-linear labyrinthine design, followed by a more linear section. The fifth chapter returns to the much more linear design of the first, and also is much shorter than the rest, and is the one point where there's noticeable enemy reuse. And the final chapter is unfinished. Literally, that's the title. Jokes aside, it does actually feel unfinished, to the point where I feel like naming it that was earnestly some kind of meta joke. It's the most massive and most empty zone, again in an open world style layout. It's fortunately quick, but also maybe disappointingly so. There's a sort of experiential whiplash from these chapters, jumping from linear to non-linear to open world and then back and forth again. I suspect that the devs wanted to provide a variety of areas in each chapter, but instead it comes across as feeling like some chapters just got a lot more care than others, and it has an effect on the pacing that I can only describe as that feeling when you are stuck in traffic, but keep moving back and forth from total standstill to slow to open road for a moment, but then back to slow. I would much rather prefer one continuous slow speed to move at, than to have to keep managing the gas and the brakes constantly. This can also have an undesirable pacing issue in boss structure, as the game likes to put back-to-back boss fights around, a decision that I have no real positive or negative feelings on, but doesn't quite mesh well with the different chapter layouts, as a player might do a lot of exploring in the open world bits with little to no bosses and then accidentally end up running down a gauntlet of 5 or more bosses in a row, instead of finding them more evenly paced like in the rest of the game. The inconsistency is just jarring, and ends up making the pacing feel like a roller coaster, but in the most unsatisfying way, where the player isn't building up excitement anticipating the next loop, and is instead riding a long stretch of flat track before doing non-stop loops. I'm almost curious if each chapter was made by a different team and then they slapped them together afterwards, with no real unifying cohesion between design goals across level design. The handcrafted nature of the non-linear levels is top-notch, which is a difficult task to accomplish, but the flatness of the open areas is decidedly mediocre. It's almost difficult to believe that these were designed by the same people.
It wasn't all that bad, eh?
Let's dive a little deeper into the more noteworthy parts of some of the chapters. Chapter 2, which might be my favorite, is what truly surprised me and made me realize that this game had much more in common with Souls-style games than I was led to believe. The level operates on a very cool circular loop, whereby there are two major paths that lead to the final boss, but from opposite sides, and the player can explore them independently. My realization upon fully exploring the second path and realizing it had all connected perfectly was a powerful moment to me. And that's all ignoring the many smaller loops and intersections within those larger paths, from accidentally realizing I had found the frog boss from the backside and only finding the NPC directing me towards it after defeating it and leaving, or the interweaving between the cave and the cliffside, or the third middle path that connects between multiple sections of both loops. The player can find bosses, areas, NPCs, and essentially the whole chapter out of order, or perhaps just in a multitude of different orders. This is peak nonlinear gameplay, engaging from start to finish. Chapter 3 starts with a linear path and then moves into the jail, which is a weaker nonlinear section, though mostly linear, but then opens up into an almost open world type section in the snow. Everything in this section, from enemy variety, encounter design, secrets, and just general map clarity, all suffers. Enemies feel somewhat randomly scattered across a wide open plain, and the previously tight level design pumped full of secrets and hidden paths is replaced with a lot of just run into every corner style exploration. The environments are different in the details and interiors, but given everything being coated in snow, the large outdoor sections lack meaningful distinction and meaningful direction.
This place still looks the same.
In a game that otherwise has such majestic environmental design, the open zones of Chapter 3 are a noticeable step down, and especially so as this, at least to my perception, is the area most guilty of lacking enemy variety. If I never see this frozen guy with a sword again, it will be too soon.
The whole mountain was infested with those stinking corpses.
The chapter culminates in a more focused non-linear but still rather wide and empty temple to explore. It's better than the woods in that having the distinct buildings to investigate provides player goals, but the temple is still mostly empty and lacking intricate connectivity. And the excess of space leads the repetition of the same couple enemies to lack the environmental impact that would normally differentiate combat encounters. Which is to say that the diversity of enemies might not actually be that much worse than the other levels, but due to the flat open encounter design, these fights end up feeling far more repetitious than they otherwise would.
You must have had it rough all these years in this shithole!
Chapter 4 is also arguably the best, returning to that super intricate and twisty level design that works so well. When descending the hollow, the player has the clear larger goal of reaching that weird-looking area at the bottom, but also all these cliffs, bridges, webs, and tunnels to scope out along the way. And to top it all off, the level rather elegantly funnels the player to the same destination, with several possible entrances regardless of how lost the player might end up getting. The section following the hollow is noticeably more structured, but is still pleasantly stuffed with secrets despite the increased linearity. As for the unfinished chapter, it's very cool and again a surprise from left field to be given the Nimbus Cloud to fly around on, and it feels legitimately great to use too. But unfortunately, the level itself is extremely bland, with the vast majority of playable area being completely empty of anything, including enemies, items, or crafting materials.
All I'm seeing are mountains, no path at all.
There's weirdly one single non-boss enemy scattered around in random clumps that makes it feel almost worse than if there had been no enemies at all, given the way it just distracts from what the actual goal of the area is. There are 10 or so bosses, of which nearly half are Poison Chief for some reason, which is odd as in no other part of the game have bosses been repeated in this completely unaltered way, and there's no real reward or purpose to finding them all.
Don't waste your time on him.
Which is the primary issue with this chapter as a whole. The player is shoved out into a mostly lifeless zone and given no direction or goal. What the player actually has to do is locate a handful of slightly visually distinct areas and defeat the bosses there to collect Wukong's armor and open the way to the final boss. The areas are distinct enough that once the player figures out what they're supposed to do, they can pretty quickly get the rest done, but the whole time they'll be thinking, why am I doing this? Is this even the right thing? Or is this some optional side stuff? Since this is the final stretch, and the player is ready for the final showdown, the appeal of optional content is far less than if this were to occur earlier in the game, and half of the bosses in this area not only are optional side stuff, but reward nothing meaningful despite being hidden behind particle effects that are so small they're barely noticeable. A player seeing multiple of the same boss after a full game of that never happening will naturally be curious to discover, why are there so many of this guy? What makes him special? And think there must be some secret behind this, but there isn't. For the rest of the game, there has been at least something behind every side path, and in the final chapter there's simply nothing. And again, it's worse due to the confusion of not knowing for sure if you found all of them, or maybe there's a fifth poison chief that you missed and that's the one that gives the reward for clearing them all. Even in the previous open world zones, there was at least something to find by checking into every little nook and cranny. It's disappointing both because it clashes with the design of the entire rest of the game, but also because it leads to the player questioning if they are just messing up and continuing to search for nothing until they eventually give up.
Scour all you like. It won't make a difference.
Because there is no communication to the player, every player will go through the same process of confusion and frustration, and eventually reach the same stage of giving up after variable amounts of time depending on the player's personality. Unless you were told by someone else externally from the game, of course. As much as I don't like the game breaking meta walls like this, it still would have been preferable here to simply have a pop-up message from the game saying, hey, just fight the bosses and move on, don't waste your time, there's nothing else to find. But it doubly stings as the concept of flying around the world is so fun that I would have loved to have a meaningful way to use this cool new power, and instead it's used in this very short section and can't be brought up anywhere else, even in the prior zones. It's cool and fun, and I wish we had something more to actually do with it.
But I see great potential in this.
There's another element of the pacing that doesn't always land too, and that's the enemy difficulty. Not the overall game difficulty, but rather individual enemies in relation to those around them. The game goes through weird cycles of having really easy fodder enemies, only to suddenly have enemies that don't look more powerful, but have massively increased health pools, followed by a return to sections with very weak enemies. Normally a power spike like that would indicate to the player that they are going the wrong way, or at least approaching a zone that's a bigger leap in difficulty than the intended path, and to help guide the player. But Black Myth's difficulty progression happens in a discrete chapter basis rather than one connective world, so their occurrence seems randomly intermixed between enemies instead of normal difficulty. Similarly, there's a classic video game trope of putting a very powerful enemy in the game, which both teaches the player that they can come back for things later, and also gives them something exciting to look forward to besting once they are stronger.
It may be too hard for you to complete.
This game even does that with the Yin Tiger, who you can challenge as soon as you reach the hub, but is probably far too strong to actually beat until later on.
Train well before returning here.
This creates an engaging player dynamic where they are excited to go back and test their mettle each time they feel stronger. Unfortunately, this game also messes up that same idea. The white in Chapter 1 is that classic example, but then if the player finishes a later part in Chapter 1, the white will disappear. This weirdly contradicts the teachings, as now the player is learning that they shouldn't actually skip content, despite how difficult it may be, because it could randomly not be available later. The white's disappearance arguably makes sense from a narrative perspective, but from a gameplay perspective, it sets a very bad implication, because now the player is worried that if they can't beat Yin Tiger right away, they might lose the opportunity, so they are encouraged to bash their head against this problem that was intended to be fought much later, and since the white's disappearance wasn't indicated preemptively in any way, the player can't simply risk waiting, as they have no clue when the tiger might go away, and the game has set the precedent that things can disappear without notice.
He left without a trace.
I want to be clear, I enjoy when actions have consequences. There's no issue with the white being missable. The issue is the manner in which the white is missable and how it's not clearly indicated. And this isn't that kind of choice-based, narrative-focused RPG experience where it's cool when the world exists and lives beyond the player and their actions. In a game that allows and even encourages the player to go back and explore stuff they missed, including secret areas with narrative, having a handful of times where, for narrative's sake, the game breaks its own rules in weirdly inconsistent ways is not good. It's surprising, but for all the wrong reasons. There's a couple final points that I want to address that couldn't quite fit into the earlier sections, so let me quickly knock those out before we finish on the narrative. There's a handful of cool ways that skills allow the player to explore in new ways by adding extra layers of movement, like using a jump attack to function like a double jump to reach slightly higher ledges, or using cloud dash mid-air to cross longer gaps. These feel almost like platformer or Metroidvania style extensions and upgrades to the player's mobility that would allow them to go back and find new secrets, but the game actually never requires them beyond a couple of niche moments, which also makes those niche moments feel even more out of place. Healing lacks an input buffer, which means that the player has to mash healing, which could inadvertently cause multiple uses at once, or else wait a second to confirm if the heal went through, or if they need to press it again. It's a small touch that, combined with other things having input buffering, makes the combat feel just slightly less fluid than it should. Bosses have somewhat inconsistent rules, with cinematic guaranteed damage and attacks, and invulnerability phases that can happen in real time, causing power-ups and spells to be wasted waiting for combat to start again. This kind of stuff would be a huge no-no in a strictly Souls game, but in a cinematic action game would be far too minute to worry about. It doesn't bother me here due to Black Myth's somewhat hybrid approach, but I can easily see other people being frustrated if they come in with preconceived expectations. Certain bosses suffer wildly from inconsistent hitboxes, which, due to the slow and cumbersome nature of heavy attacks, can mean that the big final piece of the player's combo can just disappear, even though it visually hit the boss perfectly. When the combat loop revolves around building up to those big finishers, and then the finisher whiffs for reasons that aren't clear, the whole fight can feel like a waste. This happens in games, but it happened frequently enough here that it was a noticeable issue that I have to at least mention. In the same vein, spells can whiff or be eaten for reasons that are also unclear. I think due to there being a slight cast animation that can get interrupted, but the game doesn't make this clear at all, and the player has to notice that their spell is on cooldown to even realize that it's not that the spell didn't go off, it did and just poofed for some reason.
How could it simply vanish?
This is especially problematic for spells like Immobilize, which have a skill unlock asking the player to use it at the last second for some benefit, but often using it with such close timing results in not only the spell not working, but also in the spell being put on cooldown as if it had been cast. Since so much of the combat is maximizing the use of your spells and mana in the best possible way, this functionality can completely ruin fights if it happens frequently enough, and was such an issue that it felt safer to just never attempt the close timing of Immobilize. Less egregious but equally frustrating is that the rock parry actually has the player character bend down a bit, which occasionally results in the player missing despite proper timing because the player's hitbox moved lower. Yes, the player dodged the hit, but much of that spell's utility comes from landing the parry, and also it creates a catch-22 situation where the player is punished for missing the parry because they ducked too low, but also would have been hit if they hadn't cast the spell and ducked. It's lose-lose.
Didn't help him much.
One of my favorite surprises was unlocking the hub area and having all of our pals that we've collected move in. It seemed to indicate that we would be slowly building up a big squad, but then, despite there being many more animals in the Zodiac, we never actually add even a single new companion after that point. There's even a lot of empty space that looks like it's tailor-made for others to show up in. I'm not sure if it was accidental, cut content, or carved out for DLC, but regardless, the end result is that the hub instead feels lifeless and sad. New Game Plus is given a lot of love and care. I absolutely love when games put that extra attention in for players who want more, so I will always praise this. There's new weapons, new features, quality of life like upgrading armor from any shrine instead of having to load into the hub, and even extra power progression to the player in the form of additional curio slots and unlocking an additional relic point each time you beat a chapter boss again. Still not quite to the quality level of Dark Souls 2 or Nioh, but good touches nonetheless. The player is given the freedom to respec their build freely at the shrine, encouraging experimentation and allowing the player to create their own variety by planning different builds and strategies against different enemies. In a heavy-duty choices matter type game like Cyberpunk, you'd want the player to have to commit to their choices and deal with the consequences of their actions, so a free respec system would somewhat ruin the game, but for an action-focused game like this, it works perfectly. One of the coolest moments in the game came when, midway through the first chapter in a secret area, I unlocked an item that said, "Hey, now you can traverse lava areas." I didn't even know there were lava areas I couldn't traverse yet, but now I was looking forward to finding all of those. But more importantly, I was excited about what other types of hidden tools I would find that would let me come back and explore new areas that I wasn't even aware of yet. And the answer was almost nothing. The game sets up this expectation that there will be secrets to come back for and traversal-based rewards to unlock, but then delivers on none of that promise. The lava paths exist only in a single chapter so long after the first chapter that I bet most players had forgotten about it, and there is nothing else comparable to that in the game. Technically, there's a dragon scale that lets the player enter waterfalls, but there are only a select few waterfalls in the entire game, and aside from that, there is nothing else. There's even the other moves I mentioned earlier, like double jumping and dash jumping, that allow the player to access new areas, but the game has essentially no clever usage of those tools at all.
You barely use any of it.
This inconsistent implementation is especially disappointing due to how early the item is found, and thus how much time that expectation and excitement has to sour during the playthrough. It might sound incongruous to say, but had the devs done less and simply provided innate lava immunity and never added the cool item effect at all, the hope would never have been able to be ruined.
But you chose to ruin my day!
The character designs across all the different creatures, friend and foe, and the correlating animation work is incredible. I was constantly in awe of the beautiful artistic direction behind all of these creative creatures. I don't have the educated artistic background to tell you exactly why these designs are so incredible, and I suspect that many of them are influenced by the deep Chinese lore that this game takes influence from, but regardless as to whether these are wholly original designs or merely artists' renditions of classic characters, what they ended up displaying is a lot of really beautiful and memorable designs. Combined with the sheer number of unique bosses, the quality and quantity of animations is stunning, and doubly so as it's pretty damn near universally not just visually impressive, but clear and readable too, assuming the camera can show them. It's no small task, and this one was unambiguously knocked out of the park. Alright, the narrative discussion has arrived, and although it won't be the most in-depth, it will be discussing full spoilers, so if you want to avoid any of it, here's your moment. Black Myth Wukong is a tough one for me to approach, both because of the limited way that narrative is delivered in the game, but also due to the source material. You see, my understanding of Journey to the West is that of a high school student with assigned reading. That is to say, I read the Spark Notes. Or I was going to, but I got distracted by video games and YouTube videos. You're not doing that right now, are you? So when I experienced the story this game was presenting, I had no clue who anyone was. And since this game delivers much of its lore in a Souls style through text descriptions and character bios, I expected to often have incomplete information. But this game also has a strong cinematic presence and pushes a lot of straightforward narrative too. And while it's not too hard to follow the general idea of what's happening, I often felt like I was missing a lot of important context. Characters were introduced as if we already knew them. Discussions were about events I was not privy to, but without the explanation to clue me in on what they really were. And generally there was this reaction across the game of characters responding to and reflecting on the actions of Wukong before me, of which I have no knowledge or understanding. It felt like I was playing the sequel in a series where I never played the first game. And that's because that's exactly what's happening. As it turns out, the plot of this game all takes place after Journey to the West. It's not an adaptation of the famous story, it's a sequel, or a fanfiction imagining of what a sequel could be. And I'm saying this not just to tell you my experience, but because I think that distinction is important. The player who has read and knows Journey to the West will have a vastly different experience from my own, and I cannot judge what that would look like. I can only give my perspective. It's no more or less valid to have read the source material or not, but it will change your experience, I suspect, drastically, and I want to get that out of the way immediately. This is an analysis from the lens of someone not familiar with the source material. I'm also saying that because I think something clever has been done here in regards to that. In Journey to the West, Wukong is returned and traveling the world again. We play as the Destined One, a mute protagonist who has no understanding of the events or actions that Wukong partook in prior to our existence. While this dampens the final twist of our character not being the return of Wukong, it provides an immersive synergy between the player and the character. Since the Destined One is a blank slate, this allows the player to fully insert into that character and not feel left out. Or rather, to feel as though it makes sense when the player is confused as to what's going on. I think sometimes that style of a mute protagonist can be a cop-out, but it fits rather neatly here, and due to the intentionality, I think in this instance it works.
Great, another mute. Whatever.
That said, the lack of understanding also leads to a dulling of emotion and investment in certain moments. The ending to Chapter 5 felt like a very powerful and poignant moment. A mother protecting her child only for him to take his own life after having betrayed his father. But because I was spending so much time trying to figure out what happened and what was going on, the actual emotional intensity of the scene never quite got to blossom. It's hard to let those narrative beats land when the viewer is simultaneously trying to figure out, wait, is this a flashback? Or who was that? Why is Wukong here suddenly? Are he and the king friends? They seemed like enemies. The game also features short films between each chapter, and I really enjoyed these. Each one is animated in a beautiful style and tells its own little story. These typically serve to explain the backstory of the chapter boss that you just defeated, and are a very fun way to fill the player in on everything they just missed. They're also largely standalone and thus can be fully enjoyed without really needing context from anything else. And as such, these were, to me, far more emotionally poignant than any of the actual scenes in the game. I was pleasantly surprised when the first one began, and when the second one began in a very different animation style, I thought, oh cool, they're going to do a unique animation style for each chapter. But that turned out to be the one animation that was different for some reason, and the rest were back to the same style. Another odd inconsistency. The Tale of the Man and the Fox was my personal favorite too. It was beautifully portrayed, and due to the standalone nature of the story, was able to fully hit me with all of its emotional weight. It's also weirdly the one chapter that doesn't cover the previous chapter boss, instead setting up a side boss in the next zone. I'm not sure why that one boss got the short stick, but I'm not complaining either. Though again, it's weirdly inconsistent. There's also an impressive amount of lore to read in the journal. Every single character has paragraphs of story being delivered should you choose to read them, and several of them are rather touching tales on their own too. At the bare minimum, they're a fun little entertaining distraction when you've gotten a little tired of the core combat. There was a point in the middle of the game when I was trying to think, what's going on here? What's my motivation? What's my end goal? Technically, I am chasing after reviving Wukong, but really the thing I, as the player, want is to refight Erlang from the beginning of the game and beat his ass. And I was somewhat surprised and disappointed when I beat the game and that didn't happen. But yet again, showing their care for doing it right, Game Science snuck in a secret ending that gave me exactly what I wanted. A showdown with Erlang and a great boss fight on top of it.
A strong foe. Just what I need.
For my personal narrative experience, they gave me everything I wanted and left me fully satisfied. On the whole, the thing that impressed me, however, was not so much the narrative being told, but the characters and aesthetics of the experience along the way. The bosses often have interesting dynamics on display with their interactions. Zhu Bajie makes great conversation as your intermittent companion.
Young one, did you ever hear the story of him?
Shout out to the Headless Bard, who I wish was there to sing a summary of every chapter. There's also a lot of really cool lore connections, like how Wukong had to face 81 trials, and there are 81 achievements for the game. Or how the damage cap is 108,000, which is the length of a single leap from Wukong, and the max level being 342, which was Wukong's final recorded age. And one of the most impressive details was the way these characters actually react and respond to lore-sensitive things. From the shell of Sun Wukong being an obnoxious little shit, having a troll move for almost every action the player can take, which perfectly encapsulates his personality, all the way down to simple mid-bosses reacting to you transforming into a character that they canonically would know. Transforming into Guangxi will get responses from the other bosses in the level who knew him. Erlang has a unique line of dialogue for every single transformation in the game. Countering a boss with the relevant vessel earns unique dialogue.
Winton, how is it yours to use?
And many other bosses will comment on your use of spells, whether transformation or the more normal spells. It goes a long way towards making the world feel alive and responsive. The boss being ticked off that I went invisible and now they can't find me adds a meta level of satisfaction that's hard to replicate. My personal favorite, though, is the way in which the Tiger Vanguard reacts to the stone parry. Because you fight him in a flashback/time travel situation, if you have defeated his son and learned the parry move, he has not one but multiple different lines expressing shock that you know his secret family spell that he invented himself.
This is my secret spell. I'll charge you. Oh, why did you learn that out?
Connecting the dots made what was already a cool interaction into a somber moment as I realized that he was the father of the evil tiger I had killed earlier, and realizing what that meant for his future and the cubs that he was bragging about. For someone like myself, it was in those smaller moments that the narrative was able to truly shine.
You are all I care for.
If there's one thing that's true, it's that Black Myth Wukong surprised me. I was surprised by the type of game it ended up being. I was surprised by how much of the narrative I felt was missing, and also by how much I still enjoyed other parts despite that gap. I was surprised both at the way the game succeeded and also by the ways it failed. It showed a knowledge of other games and a readiness to evolve mechanics past those games, but also stumbled on some very basic steps that I wouldn't expect any major title to fumble. There were times when I think its influence from other games felt a bit too one-to-one, even down to the animation work, and times when I was excited to see new ground being tread in a beloved genre. Despite its flaws, this was the most fun I had in a game in a long time. At the end of the day, there are too many issues to call this a masterpiece. There's a lot of great ideas, just hampered by inconsistent implementation. It can't quite be placed up there with the pantheon of the genre greats, but it's knocking at their door. And to achieve something so special on their first attempt is more than worthy of praise. So as Wukong walks off into immortality, I'm left with a lot of hope in the potential of whatever comes next. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. I guess if you made it this far you probably did, but I want to hear your thoughts, agree or disagree. These videos take a long time to produce, especially because I always try to make sure that every single second is showing something that reinforces my point, instead of simply talking over unrelated footage and rushing out a less in-depth analysis. All of that is to say that I greatly appreciate all your support, and I'm told that if you mention subscribing, people are more likely to do it, so I guess here's me saying, like and subscribe. Anyway, that's just my 5 cents. Thanks for watching.